Time had passed, weeks and months and years now. It was as if everyone had been holding their breath, waiting for things to get better. Perhaps this was the day. It was a summer's afternoon, and it was hot. Wide sunlight angled down through the windows, and Laura and Jack stood in the drawing room, looking nervous in their new clothes. Laura, in uncomfortable crinoline, and Jack in a high-necked collar, starched, naturally. An older man called Dr. Abel came in, wearing a finely tailored suit with a most decorous waistcoat. "Listen to me," he said. "Listen to me. We all know what to do, but we must be very, very careful." "Is he awake?" asked Laura. "Soon," said Dr. Abel. "But remember, he is more important than you can know. We all have our parts to play, so be careful. Remember what I told you." He smoothed his hair. "Ready?" Laura and Jack swallowed and nodded. They all straightened their clothes one last time. They looked perfect. Up on the landing, they opened a door and went through into a large bedroom. There, in clean white bedding, lay a handsome young man. His skin was as pale as the sheets themselves, and his lips trembled a little. If it wasn't for the fact that it was the height of summer, you could be forgiven for thinking that the poor boy was shivering in some intense cold. Dr. Abel nodded, and Laura took up the patient's hand. They stood like that for what to them seemed like an hour, until the handsome man slowly opened his eyes. For the first few moments, he thought he might be dead and drifting towards an intense light. And then he could have sworn in all certainty that indeed he had passed over. For above him was floating the most beautiful angel he could have imagined. Shimmering blonde hair, the kindest eyes of cornflower blue, and sweet, full lips that spake his name over and over. "Thomas, Thomas? Can you hear me, Thomas? Please don't worry. You've been very, very ill," said Laura. And then Dr. Abel added, "But you are safe now. I'm your doctor, and Laura will look after you." Thomas worked his mouth, but no sound came out. "Rest now, Thomas," said Laura. "You're our guest, and I'll care for you." And Laura was true to her word. She looked after Thomas day and night. The poor man was so very weak and could do little more than move his head and try to smile at his beautiful nurse. After 4 slow days, he managed to speak and asked the question that had been building inside. "Where am I?" he croaked. Laura leaned close. "You can speak," she said. "I was beginning to worry that you were a mute." Thomas smiled. "What happened?" "You've been very ill, Thomas, and I'm helping you to get well." Thomas looked out the window. "It's summertime." He sounded surprised. "Yes, July 16th, said Laura. 1852, said Thomas. "Yes, of course, I know. It's just that all I remember is the cold winter." "I'll get Dr. Abel," said Laura. "He can answer your questions. Let me get you some water." And Dr. Abel came and told him the terrible news that Laura couldn't say. Thomas's parents were dead. They'd been ill. They'd all been ill, but only Thomas had survived. It was an epidemic that had killed everyone in his town and for miles around, but he was safe now. The disease had gone as swiftly as it had arrived. Poor Thomas was brave, but silent tears ran down his cheeks. Laura put her hand on his forehead and smiled down at him. "You must try and stay calm, Thomas. You're very weak. I know it's terrible news, but try not to be too upset. You're with us now." The days passed, and Thomas slowly began to recover. Every day, Laura cared for him as if he was the most important man in the entire world, and every day Dr. Abel came to draw some blood and then left with a reassuring smile. Now, occasionally, Dr. Abel came in with some other men. He introduced his fellow doctors, and they would prod him, ask questions, and then talk amongst themselves in hushed whispers before smiling and then leaving. One of the doctors even bowed once in what seemed to be a mocking gesture. And Thomas felt uncomfortable, but not understanding the joke, and heard Dr. Abel shout at the man outside. That particular doctor didn't visit again. As the days slipped into weeks, he regained his collar and was able to sit up in bed and then slowly to feed himself. Then some weeks later, he eventually took a few faltering steps with the help of Laura and young Jack. It was an undeniably idyllic place to convalesce. Laura would sometimes leave his door ajar as she played the piano in the drawing room, and from time to time, he'd see children playing outside in the gardens and the smell of food wafting in from the kitchens. Yet still, his sense of unease would not leave him. It was the small things, the way everyone was so very careful around him, as if frightened to say the wrong thing, and the way their clothes were always so clean and neat. For all their care, Thomas couldn't help feel like he was being treated like a simple, favourite pet. As his health improved, he had more questions of the beautiful Laura. "Where exactly are we?" he said one morning as she brushed his hair. "In the village," came her reply. Her breath was sweet, and a curl of blonde hair tumbled over her face. "But where, Laura?" "In the country, far away from people," she answered. Dear Lord, she was gorgeous. "Oh, yes," he said, and felt the hairbrush move rhythmically over his locks. "The country." "Yes, Thomas." Thomas cleared his throat, and he tried to take his mind off what was stirring down below. "Perhaps we could take a walk outside soon. I'm feeling much better." "Oh, no. You must be back to full health," she said. "You must not go outside yet. Soon, though, soon." "Do you like me brushing your hair, Thomas?" He could barely answer. Despite Laura's evasion, he knew he was falling hopelessly in love with her. Not only was she kind and gentle and clever and laughed at his silly jokes, but she was so clearly the most beautiful, perfect creature he had ever set his eyes upon. He didn't yet know it, but she, in turn, was falling in love with him. And so we come to late summer, and Thomas was able to walk unaided and allowed out of bed to sit in the drawing room for his meals and read the books that Laura brought him. But still, the good people worried over him and fussed. Perhaps he still wasn't totally recovered, but he was bored and, more importantly, inquisitive. He still wasn't allowed outside. In fact, he wasn't allowed out of the few rooms available to him. He felt like a prisoner. It actually crossed his mind that he was a prisoner, the proverbial bird in a gilded cage. And so, one hot night, he was lying on his bed with the window open and a soft breeze moving the curtains. He'd been inside this room for too long. Everyone told him that he wasn't fit enough, yet he felt absolutely fine. Were they hiding something from him? What the devil was out there? Taking a few quick steps, he quietly opened his door and looked out onto the drawing room. He saw young Jack asleep in a chair by the door. Was he supposed to be standing guard? Surely not. Thomas was a guest, not a prisoner. Thomas tiptoed across the room in his dressing gown and tried to open the door. Locked. If he was a guest, then why was the door locked? He looked back at the sleeping Jack, and he saw the key on the table. Thomas took it, unlocked the door, and stepped carefully onto the street. Well, I say street, it was more of a dirt road. And the only light was the full moon shining down, casting lovely shadows as he walked. Some distance away, he saw a large barn, but the windows seemed to glow brightly from within. And as he got closer, he saw that the barn wasn't the rude construction he'd assumed. The timber was finely sawn, and the door bore the single word, laboratory. Intrigued, he opened the door. Well, whatever he was expecting, it certainly wasn't this. There, in the bright white of the overhead strip lights, was a long bench of vials and test tubes and centrifuges and microscopes Needles flickered on gauges and dials, and then he saw a bank of what we know as monitors, but to Thomas they were metal boxes showing photographs of his bedroom, the drawing room, even his bathroom. He looked closer, and the picture of his bedroom, it seemed to move. A moving picture in a box. Suddenly he saw a moving figure in the box in his room. It was Laura. What wizardry is this? The light seemed to hum above him with the brightness of the sun. He understood nothing. What place was this? What wonders? What magic? Thomas felt his heart suddenly pump faster, ready and desperate to run back to his room. Cold sweat soaked him through as he paced back and forth, trying to make sense of this place. Perhaps it was all a fevered madness and they were right to keep him locked up. So he started to get back into his bed, but the door was suddenly opened and Laura was standing there. She'd clearly dressed in a hurry and her hair hung long around her shoulders. She dropped a backpack at her feet. "I saw you," she said, "running back here." He held her arms and looked into her eyes for help. "Yes, but I fear I am mad, or you are all mad, and am I still ill?" "Did anyone else see you, Thomas?" "What? No, I don't think so. I just saw all those things and then..." "You are not mad," she said, touching his cheek. "It's Oz. I'm sorry. The people here they're not as they seem. In truth, they're evil." And Laura tried to hold back her tears as she told him how they must leave together that very night. Thomas must trust her. Did he trust her? The poor man was very confused. He knew he'd loved her, but he wasn't sure about anything else. "We must go, Thomas," she said. And they slipped hand in hand away from the village and into the countryside, where they left the road and headed across the moonlit flower meadows and onto empty wide pastures. They walked fast and didn't sleep until dawn, and then awoke at midday before setting off again to get away as far as possible. The dizzy rush of love paused enough for Thomas to question the plan a second. Did they even have a plan, he thought? "Where are we going to, love?" he asked. "Far away," Laura answered. "Well, shall we take a train?" he asked. "How far is the nearest town? Do you know people?" "Very remote. There's nothing for many miles," Laura said. "That's how we survived the pandemic, Thomas." "There's just us now." Thomas stopped walking. "Pandemic? Just us?" "Yes. It's just us. But we can find a town." Laura put her finger on his lips. "Just us in the world, Thomas. They all died. The towns and cities are empty. Just the dead. We're alone now." "The disease that killed my parents, you mean?" Thomas asked. "Well, yes. The same one, but only more virulent. No one survived out here." Now, Thomas wasn't ready for any of this. He sat down hard. "What? Everyone is dead?" "Yes," said Laura. "They said we couldn't tell you. They thought the shock would kill you or you wouldn't cope with it, but you must have suspected something was wrong after you saw the laboratory. So I can tell you now. No secrets anymore." Laura looked up at the trees a moment, breathed in deeply and said, It's 1952, Thomas." Thomas looked at her, confused, empty. "It's 1952. Yes. Everything changed after the war. The world was broken and... The war?" Thomas asked. What war?" "Oh, yes, I'm sorry, you don't know. The Second World War." "The second?" Laura took his hand. So much had happened. So much had changed. Laura smiled, almost laughed, and then her face changed, and she began coughing more and more until she fell forward. Thomas took her in his arms. "Laura?" She coughed more and then quickly convulsed and then more coughing until blood splattered the ground below. "I thought I had longer," she said, and all the strength went out of her. "That is how it is," she said. "We watched one of the television special broadcast." Thomas didn't understand. "I have to take you back, Laura." And he picked her up. "They can help you. Laura protested. No, 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 we can't go back. They're monsters, you don't know them. He refused to listen anymore. He knew Dr. Abel was kind and clever and would be able to help. It was early morning before Thomas staggered through the trees and back into the village. He was exhausted, and he fell to his knees with Laura asleep in his arms. The people of the village were now dressed in peculiar garb, men in open-necked short-sleeved shirts and many of the women in trousers. Someone shouted for Dr. Abel to come quickly. Dr. Abel came running and stood off a distance, as did the others. There were suddenly men in strange, all-covering white suits with large helmets over their heads and faces. They carefully took Laura from him. Dr. Abel put his arm around Thomas and told him everything would be all right, and they would look after them both. There was nothing to worry about, and he'd done the right thing to come back. Laura was nursed by the kind people of the community, as Dr. Abel said. Oh, you know everything now. I hope you realize why we kept it secret. We had to create the time you lived in. You've been asleep for so long, and the shock of our modern world could have driven you insane or worse. You were so very weak. Can you forgive us? But Thomas didn't know everything. He thought that perhaps Laura had been delirious, but he had actually been asleep for 100 years. Dr. Abel showed Thomas the capsule in which he had been frozen for so long. It was complicated and large, with tubes and dials that Thomas didn't understand. Dr. Abel started to try and explain about cryogenics, how it had been preserved for the future, for the good of humanity. But Thomas was confused and could smell the strangely familiar chemicals that still emanated from within. And he remembered. He remembered the dead and the dying all around him. He remembered his parents lying in the beds, coughing blood, and how he felt utterly useless to help. And he remembered the doctors who said that he must sleep for the good of humanity. Genius, Dr. Abel smiled. We still don't know quite how they did it, and it was very tricky to bring you back. But I think we did a pretty good job of it. But what was it all for? Said Thomas. Why am I here? You were, and are, immune to the disease, said Dr. Abel. Your people knew that one day the disease would return, and your blood held a key that with the help of modern science could create an antidote. And now, that day has come. You are in possession of a truly extraordinary gift. Would Thomas let them use his blood to create a cure for the evil disease? They would have to take his bone marrow, which would clearly end his life. The people of this kindly community were the last surviving people on Earth. Without his gift, they would all succumb to the disease. It's a simple choice. Save humanity and the girl he loves by giving up his life, or wander the Earth alone. It's your choice, Thomas, Dr. Abel said. We won't force you. We can't force you. You have to be well and utterly unstressed for the operation to be a success. It has to be your choice. Go and think on it. Laura was in a deep sleep, wired up to numerous magical devices, and Thomas was at her side. She didn't have long. Outside, the community went about its business. Laughter filled the air, and the sun still shone. Tears came silently. But he was happy. And he kissed his love on those beautiful lips. And he knew what he must do. Thomas was on the operating table in the laboratory, staring up at the wonderful, bright lights and the beautiful equipment all around him. A rhythmical beep came from the machinery. The medical staff fussed around with confidence, and he felt strangely calm. 100 years ago, he had been put in that capsule against his will, as a freak of nature, a tool of science. But now, he thanked them, for he was willingly giving life to the woman he loved, and to the kind people of this community so far advanced than his own. Dr. Abel's voice came from above. "You won't feel anything, Thomas. You'll soon be asleep. Again." "Thank you." Thomas smiled and looked over at the neat calendar on the wall, adorned with a proud heraldic eagle. 1952. Such marvels. What an age to live in. There were so many questions, but no time now. Everything was all right. Laura would live, and so would Dr. Abel and all the others. It gave him pride and joy to know that they'd prosper and repopulate the earth, rebuild society in their image. Thomas smiled. He looked back up at Dr. Abel and then focused in on the pretty little badge on the doctor's lapel. It was a neat black cross with its 4 legs bent at 90 degrees. He wondered what it meant. A country? A club, perhaps? He liked it. Simple, clean. It seemed to him like a mechanical wheel, moving forward for the good of all. Yes, that must be it. A symbol of hope.